So the movie that's been going on in the background is actually just ending. I guess it just ended in perfect timing, and I actually wanted you to see it, so I'll restart it. When we met before we started here today, outside, Idan asked us if there's any way we could link the talks to one another. And since I knew that Niels would be talking before me about brain-machine interface, then what I'm showing you here is a nose-machine interface. Because our lab studies the nose in a sort of roundabout way. And it actually works. What you're seeing here is, in this case, a healthy demonstrator, or more or less healthy, where what you're seeing is the sensor put on my nose. Down here on the bottom, you're seeing my nasal sniff trace. Up on the left, you're seeing my managing of the controller. And you can see that using sniffs, you can do a pretty good job of controlling motion. You can also communicate using sniffs. So the patients of the type that Niels showed you that are referred to as locked-in patients, some of them, not all of them, but some of them can also communicate with our sniff system, and it allows them to generate language with sniffs. I imagine that later on we'll be able to talk about advantages and disadvantages between approaches such as this versus approaches such as brain-machine interface.
What do you mean by sniff? Can you explain? what is sniff?
So, depends when. But here what you've been seeing is just, I'd prefer to come back to it at the end because again, this is not the topic of what I'll be talking about, so we'll see when we have time. But basically it's just sensing pressure senses at the nose. So it's a pressure sensor. And you don't really even have to sniff. You have a little structure here in the back of your mouth, throat. It's called the soft palate. And when you flip your soft palate, anybody in the room who's ever dived or snorkeled is very familiar with it. You prevent air or prefer air from flowing through your nose versus through your mouth. And we can sense that difference. And again, not to go too much into depth now, but that flap, that soft palate, is controlled by a very special set of nerves called cranial nerves. These are nerves that reach their target organs directly from the brain, mostly in the face. They don't exit the brain via the spinal cord. So even if you have spinal damage, even very high up, you still have cranial nerves going for you. That's what allows some cases of communication through eye movements, because eye movements are also in part cranially controlled, and that's what allows this to work. But we can come back to that later on. That's it. Another topic I won't be talking to you about today, but just to show a nice image, the type of work we do in our labs. Our lab is an olfaction lab. We study the sense of smell, specifically how the brain processes odor information, what makes a banana smell like a banana, a rose like a rose. And we take advantage in our lab of a very unique opportunity. So as a rule, the neurons of the type that interest us are CNS neurons. These are brain neurons. Most of them exist under your skull or spinal cord. It's hard to reach them. So you can reach them with non-invasive imaging methods such as fMRI and so on, but these methods have their disadvantages in terms of resolution. However, we take advantage of a very unusual case whereby you have a very special set of such neurons, bipolar receptor neurons, which are the olfactory receptor neurons. These are the sensors that respond to smells. And these sensors, although they're neurons that are very, very similar to the neurons in your brain, they're actually out of your brain. They're about right here. So if you meet this finger and this finger, about 7 centimeters up from the nasal opening, you'd reach this set of neurons. And each one of you in the room has about 14 million of these neurons in your nose, of about 400 different types. And what we do is we, as you can see here with our happy participant, this is a healthy subject, not a patient of any kind. And you can see maybe the well-sighted ones, you can see this electrode going in here, and it actually goes here, and we record responses to odors in behaving individuals in vivo. That said, today, unlike the presentations before me who talked more about general overviews, I'm going to tell you a specific story about a specific study. And this specific study is in a different area of interest in our lab. One area of interest, again, is figuring out how the system works. But, oh, and here we still get to see a video of this, I'm sorry, so I'll just talk you through this quickly. You see the participant down low. Here, if you can bring up the sound now, please, and leave it up.
שאיפה, ייצרו נשימה.
Those are the instructions the patient gets,
התכוננו לריח.
the participant. And here you'll see the odor, here's the odor, and here's the response. This is a response of a few thousand neurons together. We call this response in LFP. But for us, it's just very, very exciting that we can actually see a single event response from neurons in a behaving human. But again, as I started saying today, I'll talk about a specific study in a different area of interest of our lab, and this is the area of chemical communication. So all animals use chemicals to communicate, use their sense of smell to communicate information. We can appreciate it by looking at an image such as this, where an obvious still image of chemical communication. So you may ask, what sort of information may be communicated through chemicals, through the sense of smell? And in fact, the effects are quite robust. So most of them have been validated in rodents. Here you have a list of a few of them. So for example, the Bruce effect, discovered by Bruce in 1959, is a case where if a pregnant rodent is exposed to the odorant of what is referred to as the non-stud male, she may decide to abort the pregnancy. Now, this is a very dramatic decision in terms of evolutionary cost. So you can see that a significant step is being taken here based on chemosensory information. And this, we know this is an odor that sends this signal. And you can see a list of effects here. For example, the Liebud effect is where one female can suppress estrus in other females, again, by a chemical signal. So she sets out an odor, and that odor has this effect on other neighboring females. And since we're here in the President's Conference, so I'll bring up the Coolidge effect, named after President Coolidge of the United States. Now, in 1923 to 29, I think. And the Coolidge effect is if you take a hamster, and a male hamster, and mate it to satiety with a female hamster. That is, it mates and it mates and it mates till it cannot mate no more. If you bring in a new female hamster into the cage, the male will mate again. So he has newfound strength. And this is called the Coolidge effect, named after President Coolidge. So of course now you will all wonder in your hearts why is the Coolidge effect. And of course in Israel talking about this in the context of presidency is dangerous. But that said, I will tell you about the Coolidge effect. So where did this come from? Supposedly the story goes that Mr. and Mrs. Coolidge were on a tour somewhere through rural United States, Nebraska let's say, and taken to a chicken farm. And the chicken farmer first took Mrs. Coolidge around for a demonstration or a presentation, and he showed her this huge coop with lots of chickens and one rooster. And Mrs. Coolidge asked the farmer, she said, you know, that one rooster mates with all the chickens all the time? And he said yes, and Mrs. Coolidge said he has enough stamina to actually mate all the time with all the chickens? And the farmer said yes. And so Mrs. Coolidge said, when you show Mr. Coolidge around, be sure to tell him that, you know, that this rooster has so much stamina. And she goes on, and then the farmer then shows around Mr. Coolidge, and he shows them all the chickens and the rooster, and he tells them about this rooster's achievements. And Mr. Coolidge looks at him, and he says, is it always the same chicken? And the farmer says, no. And he says, I hope you told Mrs. Coolidge about that. That's it. This is the Coolidge effect. The take-home message beyond all this is that all these effects are mediated by the sense of smell. And I won't go into the details of how we know this, but we know that if you ablate the sense of smell, especially subparts of it, you get rid of it, you get rid of these effects. So if you get rid of the sense of smell, then the Coolidge effect, the Bruce effect, and so on, these things don't occur. And these odors that are emitted by one member of a species and received by other members of the species have sometimes been referred to as pheromones. We don't need to use that term here now. It's confusing and raises a lot of problems. Now, so we're interested in chemical communication in humans. And you would ask yourself, what media carries the signals? In rodents, I didn't go into this, but most of the signals are carried in urine. So the odor is in urine. Where is the odor coming from in humans? So you could think, if there is, so you could think of some examples, and again, since we're following a political line, we'll use Sir Winston Churchill. He's a favorite of the person talking after me today, I think, here. And one signal, one sort of chemical that humans release into the world is blood. But blood is a very difficult media to deal with in a laboratory situation. A second chemical that we emit into the world constantly is sweat. And indeed, sweat has been studied in depth as a carrier of chemical signals by both us and other labs around the world. And the most famous example of a chemosignal, human chemosignal in sweat, is what's referred to as the McClintock effect, or menstrual synchrony, discovered by Martha McClintock in 1971 when she was an undergraduate at Wesleyan College. What is this effect? It's an effect very similar to the Liebut effect, and that is that human women, who live together in close proximity over time, for example, roommates in dorms, synchronize their menstrual cycle timing over time. So they start menstruating more or less at the same time. Martha noticed this as an undergraduate at Wesleyan, published it in Nature in 1971, and hypothesized at the time that the effect is probably chemical. It's probably an odor. It took her a few years more, and in 1989, now with her graduate student, I'm sorry, 98, with her graduate student Stern, again in Nature, demonstrated that it's indeed a chemical effect. How did they do this? They collected sweat from donor women at two phases of their menstrual cycle, either the ovulatory phase or the follicular phase, and they deposited this sweat on the upper lip of recipient women, unknowing, of course, the recipients did not know which sweat they were receiving. They did know it was sweat, I think, but they did not know which sweat they were receiving, whether it was ovulatory or follicular. And as you can see, you see here on the y-axis the change in cycle length. You can see that those women who received the ovulatory sweat had a longer menstrual cycle, and those women who received the follicular sweat had a shorter menstrual cycle. So this is a convincing demonstration that you have a meaningful chemical signal in sweat. And now there's evidence for a few more of these. And finally, sticking to Sir Winston, there are tears. So tears is another component or liquid that humans emit into the world and may carry a chemical signal. Now, what do we know about emotional tears? So, it's largely held that emotional tearing is a uniquely human behavior. We'll come back to this. But this is the going notion, that only humans shed emotional tears. I think it's one of the only behaviors I can think of in mammals that people say is uniquely human, besides language maybe. But we can come back to this. Another thing we know about emotional tearing is that it's evolutionary and ontogenetically late, or tearing in general. I should point out that the composition of tears is different between reflexive tears and emotional tears. So if you're poked in the eye and you have tears, their content is different from the tears that you cry when you're sad. And finally, emotional tearing in this respect was referred to by many as Darwin's paradox. Why Darwin's paradox? Darwin, till this date, still has what remains probably the most influential text on emotions, The Showing of Emotion in Man and Animals, a very good book. And in that book, Darwin systematically takes most emotions and shows us their functional antecedents. So I can give you a trivial example. When an animal is aggressive, it will aim to bite, and it will show its teeth in the process because it's going to bite. And over evolution, showing of the teeth alone becomes a sign of aggression. Now this is a simplification, but it gives you the idea, this notion that the signs of various emotions, the showing of the emotions, all had some sort of functional antecedent that makes sense. Okay? And yet in this case, Darwin himself talked often about emotional tears in this book and said that he cannot find a functional antecedent to the behavior of emotional crying. What's the function? He had no idea what its function could be in relation to emotion. Now, in contrast to this first line, and sort of maybe to give Darwin a hint, there's been some recent work in rodents, in mice, showing that their tears, or their equivalent of tears, because supposedly they don't have tears, but this is liquids that come out of their lacrimal ducts. These liquids contain a chemical signal that influences sexual behavior. Okay, this is in mice. So we have some evidence here that maybe there's something in these tears. And with this in mind, we set out to collect human emotional tears to see if they contain a chemosignal. Now, we started this off by just posting ads saying we want people who can cry easily so we can collect their tears. This generated an unfortunate gender bias in our study. And this is a cultural thing, right? There's no reason really for this beyond culture, but we ended up, after screening with about 6 really good donors who we could work with, so they could come to lab, it's actually, for each one of them, it would always be the exact same video section, and they could give us 1 ml of emotional tears. And with this, we set out to ask an initial question, and that is, does this have a smell? Can you discriminate tears from saline? So we use what's called the 3 alternative forced choice test. This is very simple. People get 3 jars. They don't know what's in them. 2 of them have saline. 1 has tears. They have to say which is which. And the quick answer is people cannot discriminate tears by smell. So here you have the probability of detection. Of course, chance would be 30% or 0.3, and you see it's more or less at that level. People cannot smell an odor in emotional tears. Now, next we set out to see if this influences people subjectively in any way. And we set out to test 2 alternative hypotheses. One would be that maybe tears signal and influence something related to the typical context we associate with tears, namely sadness, empathy, and so on and so forth. And the alternative is maybe like in rodents, they signal something sociosexual. So what people did is came into lab day after day, smelled either tears or saline, they didn't know which was which, and here they used the thing we called visual analog scales. So they see a picture, for example, like this face, and they're asked to what extent is this face sad, and they mark the line anywhere between not at all or very, or they can see a different face, and they can be asked to what extent is this face sexually arousing, and they can mark it between not at all and very, and so on and so forth. And then we can see if these markings are any different after sniffing tears or saline. And I can share with you that the effects on sadness were non-existent. You rated people equally sad, or you had equal empathy towards them. I didn't even show you how we measured this after sniffing tears or saline. However, after sniffing tears, you rated people as much less sexually attractive. Now, I will briefly spend 3 seconds on explaining what the slide means in terms of how it's set up, but there'll be a take-home message for people who don't want to go into the details. So I'll start from the take-home message. Just look at the red and the blue. So the red is what you say during saline, and the blue is what you say during tears, and you can see that you say people are less attractive after tears. If people want to go a bit more into detail, each point here is a person. This line is not a correlation, it's a unit slope line. So if the dots are above the line, then the value is higher after sniffing saline. And if the dots are below the line, the values were higher after tears. And you can see here that the dots are above the line. But again, you can just look there and you can see the difference between the two. That is, people had a reduction in arousal after, or attributed arousal, after sniffing tears. So we wanted now to add some objective measure to this subjective measure. So we had people sitting in a room for about 40 minutes watching all sorts of movies, answering questions about them. I won't go into detail. But we measured a host of measures. And these measures were physiological measures, measures like the ones used in the lie detector. For example, skin conductance, what we call GSR, or heart rate, and so on and so forth. And we also measured levels of hormones in saliva regularly throughout this process. And you can see quite striking results. So, in blue is the response after tears, and in red is the response after saline. Now, this is GSR, this is skin conductance, this is how sweaty you are, basically, or how excited you are. Now, here's where people came into the lab and sat in lab for 10 minutes, and there's absolutely no difference between the two. Here they started sniffing, and you can see that immediately there's a response for tears. Now remember, you can't tell the difference. If I ask you which is which, you don't know. But something in their nose, because you can see that there's this GSR response during sniffing to tears and less to saline. And then you just sit there for 40 minutes in our lab doing all sorts of stuff, and throughout this 40 minutes, your GSR, your skin conductance, your excitement goes down and down and down after tears, and less so after saline. So there's something depressing in terms of the GSR in the tears, and even more so in all the measures put together. So your heartbeat, your blood pressure, all these things combined. After sniffing tears, the same thing before, you see a consistent drop, and by the end of 40 minutes, it's quite consistent. And finally, in this respect, you can see the effects of sniffing tears or saline on levels of testosterone. So again, those who want to go into the details of the data, you see each subject below or above the line, here after sniffing tears, here after sniffing saline, and again, you can just look at the pronounced drop in testosterone after sniffing tears, and no such pronounced drop after sniffing saline. So we see these objective, clear cases of changes after sniffing tears. Finally, we put our subjects into the MRI machine. Now, people have talked about this today, but I assume many people in the room have never seen how this looks. So here you'll see how it looks when you set up a person for an MR experiment. And this is our participant, earphones to receive instructions, a bite bar in their mouth so they do not move at all. This keeps them motionless. The bite sort of holds your head pretty good. This is our device that generates odors into the scanner bore. It's called an olfactometer. We wrap them up quite well. There you go. We ask them if they're happy. They say yes, and away we go. And they stay in there for about 2 hours or an hour and a half when we do our scan. And here, I'm showing you 2 areas of interest that we highlighted separately. Areas involved in the arousal response. Especially, we'll look at this area, an area that's surrounding the hypothalamus, or part of the hypothalamus. And we did the same study that you saw before in our physiology room, basically. And you can see that in these areas, so this is the strength of the signal we get, some sort of proxy to neural activity over time. And these are epochs of 20 seconds that you're looking at. And you can see that there's a significant increase in activity in this area after sniffing saline, and activity is depressed after sniffing tears. And these differences are very, very significant in both these areas. So, basically, this is just a cartoon of the whole story. Tears somehow, when sniffed, change levels of activity in the hypothalamus that is probably responsible, at least through some system, in the reductions of testosterone. So, to conclude, we saw a few things. We saw that tears...
So just this is a functional accident. You can say that females
let me get there.
We're decreasing the aggressive...
Let me get there in half a minute, okay? Because that's where we're going. Okay, so what are we concluding here? First, we saw that in the first study that tears don't have an odor per se. They're indiscernible from saline. We saw that they decreased self-rated sexual appeal. We then saw that they decreased physiological arousal overall. They decreased levels of salivary testosterone, and they decreased levels of brain activity in brain substrates of arousal. Taken together, I'd say that we have convincing evidence that tears contain a chemosignal. Now, since this is the committee for the future, and where's the future going? First of all, we have a task, and our task is to find the active compound in tears. Because here's where it becomes interesting. If you can find a compound that reduces testosterone, this has, of course, various medical applications. Of course, prostate cancer is treated by reducing testosterone. There are various diseases that are treated by reducing testosterone. There's other psychiatric interests in this. And of course, you may also reduce wars, so it's also an advantage. And we also have a question in front of us. And with that, I'll end and open to discussion. And that is that, could it be that we're constantly exchanging chemical signals with each other, not very aware of it, and yet influencing each other's behavior in a pronounced way? With that, I'll thank you for your attention.